right, so everybody, welcome Charles.
Thank you, Chris. And y'all can Google me anytime you want and get all kinds of great information, but and this is also online. This is in the public domain, so go ahead and play this.
Presenting Charles Connoy, VP of Global Platform, Sony Computer Entertainment America.
What does it take to be a successful IT leader? Like any leader, vision. It means coaching people to give them the full reign of their intuition, to let them have the energy and enthusiasm to put into the product. Sony's a huge organization. What have we got? 100,000 people. And under Sony Computer Entertainment is the production of PlayStation and the organizations that create the PlayStation first-party games, which we do, and then Sony Network Entertainment, which is the umbrella for Sony Music and for Sony content that flows into the PlayStation and into other Sony devices. Innovating while minimizing business risk is really a kind of a contradiction in terms. If we don't innovate, we are going to incur maximum business risk. The only way to avoid business risk is to innovate, and we keep on innovating all the time. At Sony PlayStation, IT is the business really, and what that means is that everything we do is in the computer. Everything we do is produced by a computer. Everything we publish is stored in a computer. We complement what the corporate IT people do in their MIS groups. We're part of all the big consoles on IT and so forth that go on in Sony. Yet our dedication is specifically to making the video games work. Think about a video game, man. $60 million budget. It takes 2 or 3 years to build a video game at this style. And the people who run this thing are called producers. They are in charge, it's their budget, their career, and we are going to do everything we can to make sure that they're successful, because when they sell video games, that makes us winners. Charles Connoy, and I'm the Vice President for Global Platform at Sony Computer Entertainment Worldwide Studios. Wow, that sounds great. That sounds great.
Cool.
Okay, so what we're going to do is kind of a Q&A tonight. Chris has got some...
I got some questions and ideas, but one of the things I want to point out though is some of the cool points in the video.
Sure, okay.
Right? Because there
please
are
go ahead and do
cool
that, yeah.
Screenshots here, or slides, kind of for people to talk at. So we have.
So stop right there.
Oh yeah. So what is this area right
here?
So
the woman I'm speaking to here is one of the project managers responsible for testing a specific game, and I can't tell what this is. It might be baseball, or it might have been one of the Naughty Dog games. But this is a typical test bay, and you can see how in testing this game, and specifically in this instance, all these guys and gals who are sitting here doing testing are probably temporary employees, probably all contractors who were hired. This was probably in August, September, to test games that are just about to be released. And so they're doing final testing.
Just make sure that it's working as expected.
These guys, in this particular test bay, these guys are doing gameplay. That is, they're doing playthroughs. Rather than looking for any specific bug lists anymore, they're at the stage where they're playing just to make sure that everything that was supposed to be fixed actually got fixed.
Cool. So what's going on in this cool looking room?
How many? Stop right here. How many of you guys have seen the E3 stuff, or the stuff that's been going on with Kojima and Death Stranding, and the video maybe that Conan O'Brien was in? Anybody see that? This was in 2014. This is when we first created that camera rig that they have in Tokyo that you saw on the Conan O'Brien video, to take with 80 cameras taking a shot all at the same instant, to then be threaded together with the 3D software to create a 3D image. Previously, we had cameras that would go around a person's head. It took a long time and missed stuff. And
so they just used a whole buttload of cameras.
80 cameras, all shot at one time, nice. And the images are stitched together.
Business risk is really a kind of a contradiction in terms. Yeah. If we don't innovate, we are going to incur maximum business risk. The only way to avoid business
the other thing that was cool in here was the knock. I think it's
Sony PlayStation, IT is the business really, and what that means is that everything we do is in the
well, here's these cool.
This is one of the data centers in San Diego in 2014, 2015.
And then the actual knock here. Let's see if we can. So here you are in the knock, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
So knock network operations center. So what are you doing here in the knock?
What I try to do is stay out of the knock, because if I'm in there, something's going on. So the knock is staffed, in this case in San Diego, staffed 7 by 24 with at least 2 people, and they are monitoring. At this particular time, there were probably 60 video games, 60 games online, and at this point, this was the central knock. So games that were hosted in these data centers in San Diego and in Tokyo and in London were all being monitored by these guys here.
Right on. And so this is not for PlayStation.
PlayStation first-party games.
First-party games. So
right.
So you know this is. So Charles worked at Sony Interactive Entertainment, which was Sony Computer Entertainment, SCEA versus SIE. Mm-hmm. They changed the corporate org structure, but these are the current listing on Wikipedia of the studios that you provided IT and backing and support to.
Right,
yep.
Right.
So including Insomniac Games over in Burbank, the San Diego studio, San Mateo studio, Santa Monica studio.
And in fact, Insomniac is not on there because we didn't provide IT to Insomniac. They had their own internal IT group. And what's interesting about this, how many of you have heard the term shadow IT? Meaning, if you're talking to a corporate IT person in some corporation, they'll talk about shadow IT, meaning those other guys have got some little IT group someplace doing something. We don't really want to talk about them. Well, the studios were shadow IT to Sony corporate. We had our own IT groups. We paid a lot of attention to Sony because they gave us a lot of stuff like corporate purchasing agreements and a lot of good support. But really, all of our IT was different. It was just simply different. It was all aimed at studios. And each one of the studios had an IT team that we supported. Either we were the IT team or we supported the team, and they were all on their own. The whole idea, and one of the key things I wanted to talk about tonight was, because Chris asked me, was about small studios and how smaller teams get started. Here we have a list that is really just off of Wikipedia. It's great. There were really 22 separate studios that were all part of the group we supported. And each one had their own separate IT group. They all had their own little testing groups. They had their own design groups and so on. The entire mission given to me by my boss, Shuhei Yoshida, was that the studios had to be creative and they had to be small and independent to be creative. So,
perfect segue here to my next slide for people who have maybe not heard of Shuhei Yoshida. I made a little slide.
Great picture.
With his Twitter handle, and as you can see, he's pretty active on the Twitterverse. If you get a chance to go. For people who don't know, Shuhei Yoshida. Well, let's talk about how you met him initially and how that came about. How did you get started? Because he plays a part in the role of you coming on board.
He does.
Sony, correct?
We made. I like to think we made each other look good. I was looking for my next gig. I was in San Diego. My son worked for Sony as a producer for football. Now he works for Activision doing Call of Duty. But he said to me when I was there visiting my grandchildren one day, he said, "Why don't you come by the studio? There are some guys there working on some technical stuff, some Linux, some networking stuff. Maybe you can help them out." Okay, well, what was my background? My background had been in a lot of startups. You probably have seen me on LinkedIn, so you know as much about my background as can be said anyways. But I went over to see these fellows and in a nutshell, talked to them about their issue. And then I was so impressed, instead of spending an hour, I spent the whole afternoon and came back the next day and talked to them again. What they had been tasked to do was to figure out how to put the PlayStation 2 online.
And how many people was this team?
Oh, this is a huge group, right? 8 people.
8 people.
There was a network guy, a database guy, operating system guy, a deployment guy, Oracle guy. So we had another network security guy, and the Linux, and no, there was no 7 guys. I take it back. There really weren't that many people. There was a whole, and this is very typical of how the studios did business. Very small, dedicated teams. Let the team do it the best way that they can, and they'll figure out a way to make it happen. So after a few weeks of talking to these guys off and on, I met Shu, and he hired me.
Great. And so what was Shu doing at Sony at that time?
Shu was the VP responsible for all the studios in the U.S.
Okay. And he had just come off of, I think, Gran Turismo. He was producer for Gran Turismo?
It turns out it's very interesting. For PlayStation 1, one of the key questions that Shu asked me during my interview was to tell me, he wanted me to tell him about my experience playing video games. And I said, well, I don't play video games. I mean, except, of course, Gran Turismo, which I didn't think was a game. Well, he got really excited about that because he said, hey, that was my game. I was a producer for Gran Turismo. He found Kazunori Yamauchi, you know. He found him. He made that whole thing work for PlayStation 1. And it became a huge hit, an even bigger hit for PlayStation 2. And the rest is history.
You guys have been climbing the corporate ladder?
He climbed the corporate ladder, and I came along behind him and helped make everything look good. As things got bigger, my job got bigger. So we started off with this very small group, continued to add people. By the time I retired in 2017, I was responsible for all the IT, all the online games, all the online game software, the network, all the testing, and all the associated services for the US, for Europe, and for Japan. So PS2.
So this is the PlayStation Online adapter that you first.
God, I haven't seen a picture of that in a long time.
Yeah.
Look at that.
So if I remember correctly, I'm just gonna point at this because I played Final Fantasy 11 with a lot of Japanese players, and they were all playing on these PS2s, but they had this is the network adapter, which you literally screwed into the side of your PS2, right?
Right there.
And then, yeah, right there it is attached. But there's also a hard drive bay. So you could put I think that was a hard drive bay for a lot of the games, but so you could install them. And I think this was really one of the first times that they, I think no one had put a hard drive into home console before. It was all CD-ROM or DVD based.
Exactly.
And they were kind of transitioning to this, and I think that probably informed a lot of their opinions moving forward. And so you came in, right?
Yes, Gross, I came in.
You came in and you helped launch this.
Right.
And so, like, how did that go about? I mean, can you tell me?
It was really a chaotic time. I started it in July 2002, and we went online the last week of August 2002. And in that time, we had to develop. We had to build a data center. We didn't have a data center. We had about 10 machines scattered around. And so we in this building we were at in San Diego, we knocked down walls, created a big room, installed more air conditioning, more power, built racks. One day, 88 servers arrived, and we put the servers in and cut our hands on all the metal. You guys have probably done some of that. And that, for example, was the chaos in that time of just putting the servers in place. Well, how about deployment software? The folks who were building the software, the men and women who were doing that, had the software running on tower PCs under their desk. So if they needed a typical game like, say, SOCOM, you've heard of SOCOM? SOCOM was a client-server game and needed lobby servers, and it needed database servers and caching servers and so on. It needed, say, 30 or 40 different servers physically to run software for 8 different images. And so there had to be automatic deployment software that would take those 8 images and scatter them onto the software. And that was that way for every single game. So we had to develop that. We had to, in terms of buying those servers, by the way, we had to find a company to sell us servers. We had to convince them that we were the right kind of company to do business with, and they had to react to our engineering and engineer for us specific servers that we wanted, which Dell finally did.
Oh, it was Dell? Yeah.
Dell did it.
Nice.
I think that the network didn't work. We had to buy network cards for the servers, which we didn't find out until we did load testing. The ISP we picked was a great ISP. They just didn't have enough bandwidth. We didn't find that out until we went live, and so on.
And part of this is because really there's never been a service like this.
It never had happened before.
and you shipped with SOCOM, right?
SOCOM, Twisted Metal Block Online, Amplitude, and Football. Those were the 4 games.
Got it. And this was football before Madden Football, right? It was
right. Madden Football was going on simultaneously. EA had that. Somebody else had another football, and we had football, and then finally EA bought the whole thing.
Nice. Okay. And yeah.
So the reason I say it like this is that for those of you in small companies, going from kind of crisis to crisis is the perfectly normal way that small businesses operate. And if that's what's happening to you, you're doing the right thing.
Well, good. That's very validating. I am somehow comforted by that. So, cool. So this is my phase 1 slide.
Oh,
right?
good. Okay.
Right, there's 3 phases that we were going to talk about.
I want to thank you for your AV. This is Chris.
I try. So,
you're doing good.
I'm good with Google Images and Giphy. So yeah, you start out with about 6 guys and a couple computers, right? And that was phase 1, and then you shipped, and within a couple months, you got PlayStation Online, literally online, right?
Right.
And then after that, what was kind of the next phase of that would be, I guess, I would consider to be phase 2, right?
Right. I think
are we missing a step in between?
The in-between step was figuring out how to run the systems. So it's instructive, I guess. We were talking the other day about client-server games versus peer-to-peer online games. Everybody clear about that? Okay.
Well, for people who are not
clear. Okay.
What's the difference between a client-server game and
So
peer-to-peer?
how many of you have played a racing game where there's been split screen? Maybe a motorcycle game and there's somebody over here and somebody over here and maybe 2 controllers. Well, that kind of a game is very easy to make into an online game. Move one player onto another computer someplace else instead of having a split. And that game is considered to be a peer-to-peer game because all it takes to keep the games in sync is that the computer needs to know where on the track is the car and what's the velocity. Pretty straightforward. A client-server game like, say, SOCOM, where people are shooting at each other, requires back-end servers to track where all the bullets are, because the computers and the consoles aren't fast enough to do that.
And it's not people.
And there's not enough bandwidth in a home to do that. So we had to perfect that process. I remember sleeping on the floor one night in the hallway, something probably you guys have never done, and trying to figure out what was wrong with the database, why the database wasn't working. We had this wonderful, expensive, high-performance Oracle database, and it was supposed to be working. And we finally figured out that the only way to make it work was to develop something called a caching server to put between the servers that needed the database and the database itself, start caching and keeping the most recently used files. So we had to just figure that out, and somebody had to figure out how to create that and make that work and so on. So all those kinds of things went on for a while.
You had to figure out, caching. You had to figure out how to buy bandwidth.
How to buy bandwidth.
ISPs all over the nation, right?
How to negotiate deals with new ISPs, so we needed to add on 4 ISPs just coming right to San Diego. And then we needed to have a second data center in San Diego. All this is the first 6 months.
Right, so in the very beginning part on this graph, I think you guys can see, right, we have San Diego here, we have like a data center, you and your network operations center, and then maybe you get your second data center opened up.
In Los Angeles, right?
Over in Los Angeles.
Probably right there in LA, yeah.
And then you just kind of kept adding data centers.
Just kept adding.
Growing as the user base kept growing.
Exactly.
Right? So.
And I was mentioning earlier about E3. The very first E3, we couldn't rely upon the internet at E3 to run the servers. That is, to give access to the dozens of PlayStations that we had so people could play the game. We couldn't rely upon the internet connections at the convention center because there effectively weren't any. It was 2002. They had like 56K.
Right,
so we had to bring the servers in and put them under the PlayStation booth. And it was pretty hot. And run the system there.
Bringing in no air conditioner over there. Yeah.
And I tell this it's kind of a war story, it's kind of a comment, but the point is, in a small business, these are the kinds of normal complications that happen all the time. And if they're happening, you should be pretty comfortable that, yeah, okay, things are going right.
Cool.
So then the games developed, we developed games in the US. Next, games, we exported the technology to develop, to put the same games online in the UK, put them online in Japan, more games online in Japan, and also in Korea. So now all these groups are online, and they're still all separate.
Yeah. And so you put the games online, and then in addition to getting all of these games online, is it at this point that you start kind of working with studios more intimately, or were you doing that from the very beginning?
We're working with studios very intimately from the beginning. The studios that had the 4 games we were the most intimate with, right. And each time a studio delivered a game, we got more involved with the studio. That is to help them understand how to optimize their game and add more players, right. Continue to update the game and make it more successful.
Mm-hmm. And so, Sony brought on more studios, right? And,
right.
More games.
More games.
Right? And so let's talk a little bit, about phase 3 of this plan here, which is the cloud, right? So there's a large number of physical data centers. I mean, in that video you could see back in 2014, you had a lot of computers in those racks, in those data centers across the U.S., across the world. I
think at one point we had, I don't know how many we had, I won't say, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000, probably.
Really? Yeah, wow, that's a lot. And so, how, back in 2000, you ran your own racks, that was just how it was, right? Mm-hmm. But as time progresses, a lot of new technologies come around to allow for people to provide cloud services. So how does this infrastructure interface with kind of current technology of the cloud?
By 2008, we had a shift in games. As you can imagine, by 2008, we're in the PS3, and so we still had PS2 games running. We had a lot of PS3 games running, and PS3 games were far more sophisticated. So instead of a game running in the US and in Japan and in Europe, we were able to put a game in one place and have it operate around the world. And also because the internet is faster, right? So we put a lot of games in Ashburn, Virginia, and they could run US, Europe. Games on the West Coast could easily host and give good performance to users in Japan. Gran Turismo was good about this. The internet was also much faster. People at home had broadband by 2008. It wasn't the case in 2002. People were still using dial-up and so on. By 2010, there were far more cloud providers, and so we started to think about ways to make our footprint smaller by putting games into the cloud. So, from a data processing point of view,
I have this game lifetime chart.
Chris did this. This is great.
He drew this on the back of some papers. And
this is back of a napkin.
Into a chart,
when a game like SOCOM would first start out, you might have 80,000 players online, and it would be a huge.
Ignore these numbers. Much higher.
It would be huge for a couple of months, and then it would settle down to maybe 10 or 15,000 players online. And why was that? Well, who can guess? Come on, why was that?
They can afford.
Or there was competing games. There were competing games, right? They wanted to get it. So the hardcore would stay on, and there were other competing games that would pick up the slack. Very, very straightforward. It happened to all the games. And so by the time a game got out to some level path, then it was a good candidate to move into the cloud.
So the data centers, right? They were just populated to run in whatever the latest hit is, and then as the next hit came in, those computers would be utilized for that game, and then the previous generation game could potentially be moved into the cloud.
Right. Now, the interesting thing about this from Sony's point of view is that Sony, we were really on the leading edge of putting games into the cloud. This is something that Sony corporate liked the idea of, that is not having to spend all of our money on servers. And also, these games have a life cycle, as you can see, that a game doesn't last forever. It may last for 3 or 4 years with a lot of activity, then it kind of goes down. So why buy a bunch of computers to do that? This also had to do with our testing. We can get into testing later on, but for the same point of view, that's really why we got into cloud. Eventually, cloud technology got to be good enough so that games went directly to the cloud before they even went into the data centers.
And I'm going to say that's pretty much it. I have like one last slide. It's not really much of a slide there, but I guess one of the thoughts that I had, something we talked about was, you know, the internal culture of Sony Worldwide Studios and how they view and how Shuei views the independence of each studio as an important factor.
I think this is really a key point, and it has to do also with those of you who may be thinking about being in a small studio or being a small group. Well, let me tell you that. How many of you have heard of Journey? And
that game company, right?
From that game company. Also Untitled Goose. And what do they have in common? You played Untitled Goose? What does Journey and Untitled Goose have in common? Okay, they're both DICE Game of the Year. Sandwiched in between, you know, Call of Duty, Uncharted, and The Last of Us. Huge games. You know, these little games that are not violent. You know, my grandchildren play them. They're great games. That game company was 3 women, 1 guy from the USC Film Institute that we brought into the Santa Monica studio and gave them a place to work and gave them IT support and QA support and motion capture support. And said, you know, you guys make this game. The idea is that this is the quintessential, and this is the essence of Shuei's genius about running the studios. Keep the studios independent, let them be small, let them be on their own to develop what they want to do. It's, you know, give them the money and the time and the rope to do it, and they'll do something great. They'll make games that are great to play. And that's, in a nutshell, what Shu wanted to do. That's why there are so many studios, and that's why PlayStation had such great content during PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4.
Great stuff. So, and so your job is mainly supporting all of these studios here, and you have a large org chart of people. How many people were in your division platform?
By the time I was retiring, say 600 people.
600 people
doing IT, QA, and online games.
And it's just across the whole globe.
Right. So we had people in Japan, people in Liverpool, London, Amsterdam, and typically the way we would manage things through my directors and, you know, video conferences in the morning to talk to people in London and Liverpool, video conferences at 5 o'clock at night to talk to people in Japan, and keep everyone together that way.
And so these people, you know, they're really in service of each of the different studios.
Yes.
For the most part.
Yes.
And so the studios would be given independence essentially
Yes.
by given resources.
And our job was to give them what they needed so that they could stay independent and stay creative. This is the key thing.
Well,
Should we ask
are we doing on
question?
Yeah, I was going to say it's about questions.
It's about question time?
Perfect on the time.
I'm happy to.
But you know, before we get into questions, I just wanted to bookend with real quickly. But you know, one of the things that
what do these things say here?
Yeah, sorry, it's all one side. So one of the reasons why we wanted to have this talk was to talk about different roles in the game industry, because I think a lot of people focus very much on development or arts, but there's QA and there's IT and, you know, lots of ops involved, and we always love to just kind of shine a light, you know, on these different areas. So, you know, and part of that is to just, you know, show people that, you know, the diversity in the industry, and you know, there's lots of opportunities there as well.
Exactly. We have storytelling, obviously, art, electronic art, music, and sound, and not just sound, but sound effects and sound production. And then there's the IT people who are actually putting together servers to run the online games, and then the IT people are putting together other kinds of servers that are entirely different to optimize the build chain so games can be built, and on and on. It goes on. You've seen the credits in video games. You know, they're half-hour long now these days, right? They're huge, like the credits in movies. And so all that means opportunities and different kinds of opportunities. I also asked the question, I asked about this, there's a demographic for PS4, and who can tell me about what's the male-female demographic split for purchasers of PS4? Hmm?
It's way closer than that. It's got to be something close to like 55, 45. Somewhere
Pretty much, exactly.
Yeah.
Pretty much. And the demographic split of people who run these independent studios?
90 to 10.
No,
Quite that bad?
I would say it's more like 50-50.
Is it?
Yeah. The senior VPs who run Guilford and the things, Naughty Dog. The overall, I think it's hard to say exactly what's going on with the people doing the work, but the balance is probably close to the same demographic of people that buy the equipment. Because it's not something we really keep track of, but I wanted to point this out because there's a lot of women think that the video game business really is not for them, but obviously, clearly, Sony doesn't think so.
Well, shall we open it up to questions here? If people have any thoughts or questions they'd like to ask.
Hi, my name is Alfred.
Hi, Alfred.
You mentioned Sony Santa Monica Studio.
Mm-hmm.
With people like Cory Barlog making huge games like God of War, did that present any kind of problems with you or your department as far as like growth? Because that's a huge game in scale.
Mm-hmm.
Did that present any new problems as far as like on your end?
Well, I think the answer, I would say there are opportunities, in that the data between the most recent God of War and the previous one, they moved the studio to a different location, and when they moved the studio to a different location, it got a lot bigger, and the data center on site got quite big, and so the data center then had to have a different kind of a build chain. So we had the opportunity for us was to figure out there was different Linux guys and gals who were working on that to create a different build chain, I think. More people, so yes, more of everything. Even a separate motion capture facility was built in that same office complex for them, and I'm pretty sure that's the facility that Kojima used a bit of for Death Stranding.
So is Kojima's studio part of the SIE studios, or do you guys
They were what we would
brand
call a second-party studio. They were under exclusive contract. Their studio was actually in Tokyo, about a half block away from Sony headquarters.
Hi, my name's John.
Hi, John.
My question is, so if you're doing the server-side stuff, how would you get the information? Would you release an API or something for the developers that they would be able to access the features of the server? Or how would you work with the developers and the programmers to be able to take advantage of all that you get off of the server side?
Right.
just to repeat the
To
question.
repeat the question, the question is how I guess you're really speaking about the online games, say, right? So you're asking, is there an API that the developers would use?
It was a proprietary.
And yes, it is proprietary. It was created by a separate group, part of Richard Lee's global technology group, and I'm sure that I'm guessing at this because this is something that I personally did not get involved in, but I know that it was developed partially in LA, partially in London, and part of it had to do with the engineering people in Japan also to figure out how to create it, because the API was created so that it would work on their PCs to do development, but also, of course, then work right inside the PS4 or previously the PS3, so that the game people could have direct access to it.
So they could run the server local, and then when it was time for the release,
Absolutely. If the developers are doing something with online games, they would run everything on a PC under their desk, or a couple of PCs connected by LAN, and until the whole thing got working.
About the databases, what was in the tool set to access the databases? Did you guys use MySQL or Firebase, or was it proprietary software?
Yes. Initially, in 2002, it was really it was Oracle, and probably stayed that way for quite a few years. People went to MySQL, NoSQL. There's some proprietary databases. As the games got more sophisticated and more people had knowledge, more development, more people who knew how to do development or who worked in the studios knew how to do database development, they'd make their own choices, and whatever they wanted to use, we'd help them use it.
And that was part of the kind of giving each studio the ability to.
Right. Very often they'd come to us and say, "We're going to use this," and our answer would be, "Okay, let's make sure we got, the security people have checked it out and whatever else, and that's it. That's what you're going to use." Okay.
How does games switching to a massive digital platform versus like a physical desktop platform, how does that impact the way that you guys run like the database centers? There have to be completely separate servers that just host like download clients all the time for the digital games, or are they completely separate? Or how does that?
I want to make sure I understand your question. So you're asking about when the games are all digital versus, say, on a disc?
Yes.
How
Like does the digital aspect of the game not having any kind of physical information on a disc that the systems are reading, where does that digital information go on your end? Does it stay in their own like PlayStation Store servers, for example, that then the home consoles are pinging to download that content, or is it something different entirely?
So if a game is being sold by the PlayStation Store, then they would typically use some content distribution service to replicate it worldwide. And when I try to download a copy of, say, The Last of Us onto my disc, I don't have the digital media, but I download it. I'm downloading it from PlayStation Store directly onto the hard drive on my PS4.
Does it tax the servers at all, though, on like PlayStation's end? Is it more taxing one way or another?
It's a great question. It would if PlayStation actually did the distribution, but they've really got that farmed out to content distribution services. Akamai, for example, or services like that.
Do you believe in an immediate future of like the cloud gaming, like Google Stadia type stuff, or do you think that's, how do you see the maturity on that?
Okay, how do you see the maturity of Stadia? Okay, great. Since I didn't do anything about this officially at Sony, I can give you my opinion.
Okay.
And I've talked to a lot of people since I've retired, so this is not Sony's opinion, but it's all about content. Okay, look, the PlayStation 4 got to be the biggest selling console because of original content that nobody else had, right? And that's how it beat Xbox. And so if you look at Stadia, what are they going to do? Where are they going to get their content? They're developing some internal content. They just hired this week Shannon Studstill, the former senior director. Actually, I think they made her a VP of Santa Monica Studio. They just hired her to go move down the block to work for Phil Harrison at Stadia in Los Angeles. And Shannon's really smart, and I'm sure she knows what she's doing. And so they've got to develop content. And so services like Stadia will be successful to the extent that they can get content.
Do you believe they'll be able to deliver, though? Like the technology, from your guess, is going to be able to work out?
Yes, because PlayStation, from the Sony side, PlayStation Now has done the same thing. They started out as Gaikai, and they've gotten more and more sophisticated, better data centers. I read online all the time how they're increasing their footprint, and so the service is working well. They're very careful about the kind of games that they use and what they have to do to make sure that the games work properly. And I think that they'll be successful in markets where there's huge broadband presence. Okay, this isn't going to work in remote places where there's 56K still, or where there's a lot of lag. There's got to be really good internet presence, and where there is, I think that they will be able to get their servers to work it if they can get the right content.
One last question, please.
Was there a big shift for games using more like analytics to like track what players are doing, like when the games are live?
Absolutely. In fact, I can talk. I looked up online to see how much of this is in the public domain now. Quite a bit of it is. So I'll be happy to tell you that it was a real watershed for some of the games. And well, I can't mention which game it is, but for the developers to see a heat map or a map of their world, and then to see a heat map of where players were, and they would look at the heat map, and we showed it to them, and all the players are over here. Well, how come nobody's going here? And the developers are thinking, well, why aren't they over there? Okay, well then they have to find out why they aren't over there. But they didn't know that they weren't over there, that they weren't exploring that part of the map. And then, for example, so that analytics, logging, and they showed that, plus the testing people then were able to do testing with robots using those kinds of maps to make sure that every path and every piece of the map is being used. So absolutely, that's as much of the analytics as I can talk about, but that's absolutely a key part of it. And so it is also, I've read this online, so I can say that studios are seeing how analytics are useful, and so they are making more hooks available in their software so that analytics can provide data, or they can pump out more logging data to be examined later on.
Well, I think we are unfortunately out of time, but that was a great chat, Charles.